Adonai.
How Moses turned the Nile's waters into blood. Can they? In fact, they can, when they trigger gas leaks. And we don't have to go back 3,500 years to prove the point. In 1984 at Lake Manoon, and in 1986 at Lake Nyos, both in Cameroon, the sweet, clear lake waters suddenly turned blood red. The mystery was solved when Professor George Kling explained the phenomenon in terms of an underground gas leak.
What was happening was that the bottom waters contained very high concentrations of iron, dissolved iron. And when that was mixed up to the surface, when the gas was released, it contacted oxygen and it formed an iron hydroxide, essentially rust, the same thing that happens on cars. And that rust was what caused the reddish, brownish color at the surface of the lake. When it comes to the biblical plagues along the Nile Delta there are many elements that are present that could suggest a buildup of gas. So we could have a situation where gas beneath the earth is trapped in pockets, and earthquakes along the fault line then release that gas. And depending on the kind of water that gas goes through, it could even turn that water red.
If the Nile turned blood red as a result of a gas leak, then the chain of events described in the Bible would have been set into motion. The first thing that happens in such circumstances is that the water becomes devoid of oxygen and all living things in it die. The fish then begin to float in the polluted waters, rotting in the sun. The only things that do not die are frogs. Unlike fish, they can hop out. And as it turns out, biblical plague number 2 is a frog infestation. The lack of clean water then leads to lice, flies, and bacterial epidemics among humans and domestic animals. Not surprisingly, biblical plague number 3 is lice. Plague number 4 is flies. Plague number 5 is an epidemic. Plague 6 is boils and blisters, man and beast. Can an earthquake-induced gas leak explain this kind of outbreak? Let's go back to the 1986 disaster at Lake Nyos, Cameroon. At the time, people living along the lake developed strange boils and burns. It turns out that carbon dioxide mixed with air put people into a kind of coma, reducing circulation to the skin, causing the kind of boils described in the Bible as plague number 6. Despite the first 6 plagues, the Bible records that Pharaoh still refused to let the Israelite slaves go. So Egypt was now struck by plague number 7, hail. And it was a very unusual hail, involving ice and fire mixed together. To this day, rabbis teach that the biblical description is no metaphor.
The 7th plague was the plague of hail, but the Bible describes hail in a very unique manner. The hail was together with ash, with fire. The idea being that the fire and the ice commingled together, they coexisted together. The Bible then describes God as making a miracle within a miracle, taking opposites in nature and having them coexist together.
Incredibly, there is an Egyptian papyrus that tells the exact same story. It's called the Ipuwer Papyrus, and it's dated by many scholars to the Hyksos period. The Ipuwer Papyrus specifically states that Egypt was struck by a strange hail, made up of ice and fire mingled together. Another piece of the puzzle has fallen into place. It now seems clear that the biblical and Egyptian texts are describing what scientists call accretionary lapilli, volcanic hail that could only have come from the earthquake-induced Santorini volcano.
When the ash cloud goes up to great distances in the stratosphere, essentially what happens is you have moisture in the atmosphere. You also have a lot of water vapor in the cloud itself. So the small fragments of ash and crystals actually form a nucleus, something very similar to a hailstone.
In other words, Egypt experienced fire and ice raining from above, just as the Bible describes. It seems that earthquakes and the resulting volcanic and gas eruptions neatly explain the first 7 biblical plagues. They also explain plague number 8, locusts. Locusts migrate in swarms. There can be between 40 and 80 million adult locusts in each square kilometer. Cold weather produces a drop in their body temperature and makes them land en masse. The volcanic hail and the weather disruptions caused by the Santorini eruption would have forced great clouds of locusts, which are common in this part of the world, to suddenly land in Egypt. As the hailstorm cleared and the temperature rose, so did the locusts, exactly as the biblical account describes. Gripped by earthquake storms and their consequences, the Egyptians were now going to experience the last phase of the Santorini eruption, or what the Bible calls plague number 9, darkness. This is the way it probably worked. During the months before the eruption, seismic activity in the whole eastern Mediterranean was causing the African plate to grind under the European plate. Seawater was then turned to steam that bubbled up through the magma. This in turn caused pressure to build and erupt through weak points in the surface, triggering several small eruptions, leading to a major blowout. When the final eruption came, it created an ash cloud almost 40 kilometers from top to bottom and 200 kilometers across. When the ash cloud reached the Nile Delta, it engulfed the Egyptians in what the Bible calls a palpable darkness.
In a matter of a few minutes, they're plunged into a black world. Ash is falling around them. They can't see, they can't breathe very well. The sun has disappeared. You have black overhead, and they have no idea what's going to happen next.
The discovery of Santorini pumice at Avaris seems to prove the arrival of the ash cloud in Egypt and explains the biblical description of a prolonged darkness. Some might argue that since pumice can float, it could have been brought to Egypt by waves and washed ashore by tides. So we caught up with Professor Jean Daniel Stanley of the Smithsonian Institute. He's made the definitive discovery. He found Santorini ash in the Nile Delta. It could only have arrived in the ash cloud that plunged Egypt into the biblical darkness.
We had to look through 10 to 20,000 grains to find one ash grain. So we found a total of 40 ash grains. Not all ash looks the same. Ash has a fingerprint aspect. The ash particles that we find in the northern and northeastern Nile Delta are individual grains that came in from Santorini.
There's very little room for doubt that the Exodus account and the descriptions that we have in Egypt of this, the volcanic dust coming into Egypt, and geological description where we can actually see, feel, touch, and date the volcanic dust in the Nile, that they are describing the same tremendous volcanic event.
The final plague took place at midnight. after Moses ordered the Israelites to sit down to what became known as the first Passover meal. While the Israelites were involved in the Passover ritual, the Egyptians slept. And then it happened. Every firstborn male Egyptian died. Every house was affected. No one has ever been able to offer a plausible scientific explanation for the death of the firstborn. Until now. According to our scenario, at this point in the sequence of events that began some 6 months earlier, the gas leak that set the chain of plagues in motion would have finally erupted. Carbon dioxide would have seeped to the surface, and being heavier than air, would have killed animals and sleeping people before it dissipated harmlessly into the atmosphere. In case you think all this is conjecture, consider this. It happened in exactly the same way in 1986 at Lake Nyos, Cameroon. On the fateful night of August 21st, the villagers at Nyos went to sleep. They couldn't have known that the carbon dioxide gas, which had turned the lake blood red, was now reaching a critical point. As the people of Lake Nyos slept, the top of the lake was keeping the carbon down like a cap on a pop bottle. But then, the earth rumbled and a landslide took place, sending rock into the water, disturbing the surface pressure and releasing the gas. The gas then rose to the surface and like some alien monster emerged from the water. Droplets forming on it, turning the invisible gas into a visible fog. The fog then rolled across the water and across the land, suffocating everything in its path. And as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared, dissolving harmlessly into the atmosphere. The next day, those who had been sleeping on higher ground woke up to find some 1,800 people dead. Hundreds of cattle and small animals also dead. All around, there was deathly silence.
I was just sitting among the dead people. Inside the house, some of them were outside. Animals everywhere, lions, fowls, dogs, everything. All the family, we were 56, but 53 died.
After the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally relented, letting Moses take his people out of Egypt. According to the Bible, what made Pharaoh give up was the selectivity of the death. The fact that it was only male firstborn who died. It was this selectivity that demonstrated to him that God himself was involved. How can we account for this? Well, Egyptian firstborn males had a privileged position. They were the heirs to the throne, to property, title, and more. They slept on Egyptian beds, low to the ground, while their brothers and sisters slept on rooftops, sheds, and in wagons. The Israelites sitting up at their first Passover meal did not feel a thing, while the low-traveling gas suffocated the privileged Egyptian males sleeping in their beds. This conclusion is backed by the archaeology. At Avaris, Professor Manfred Bitak has found mass graves dating to before and during our date for the Exodus. The earlier graves are classic examples of ancient epidemics that killed men, women, and children. But at the time of the Exodus, the mass grave he found has only males in it.
Here you see bones of burials from the early 18th dynasty. They are all male victims. by the size of the graves and the number of the individuals in the graves, we think people died in rapid succession. And the individuals were just thrown into the pit, some of them lying on their stomach, some lying on their side. Some of the pits were just 20 centimeters deep and just some dust put on top of them.
The Bible says that Pharaoh's son also died during the plague of the firstborn. Since we claim that Ahmose is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, we should be able to prove that Ahmose's son died young. Searching in the Cairo Museum,
He's right over there on the shelf there.
we found Ahmose's son. The prince had died young. He was only 12. For the first time ever, we can put a face and a name to a victim of the biblical plagues.
It seems that the Bible, geology, and archaeology are all telling the same story. But skeptics, who would like to regard the Exodus as myth, might resist the idea that it actually happened. Because this would imply that God does indeed exist. Believers, on the other hand, may feel that a scientific explanation of the biblical story takes God out of the equation.
But in the book of Exodus, God does not suspend nature. He manipulates it. In other words, according to the Bible, we should be able to understand the science behind the miracles. And the greatest miracle of them all was the parting of the sea. After the death of the Egyptian firstborn males, Pharaoh let the Israelites go. He then changed his mind and pursued them, finding them trapped on the shores of a sea. The Hebrew text calls this sea Yam Suf. And it was here where the miracle occurred. The sea parted, the Israelites crossed to safety, and then the waters came back, swallowing the entire Egyptian army, overturning chariots, drowning all the horses and soldiers. For years, explorers have searched for evidence of the miracle of the parting of the sea. They've mounted underwater archaeological quests, looking for ancient chariots, swords, and any evidence of drowned Egyptian armies. There is a theory that a huge subsurface shelf in the Red Sea could have been exposed for a short time during a powerful storm, providing a land bridge for the Israelites to cross. But the search has always been unsuccessful. Who would have thought that instead of diving, we should have been driving? That's because Yam Suf, Hebrew for the place where Moses parted the waters, has for years been mistranslated as Red Sea, when in fact the correct translation is Reed Sea. And reeds grow in sweet water, not salt water, in lakes, not oceans. We should have been looking for a lake. Which lake is the Bible referring to when it describes the parting of the Reed Sea? It goes like this. Oh, and like that, like almost like a figure 8. Yes. Using our dates for the Exodus, we tracked down an ancient artifact that records the precise location of Yam Suf. It also provides us with the first archaeological evidence for the parting of the sea. We found a hieroglyphic inscription on a granite monument that tells the entire story of the Exodus from Pharaoh's point of view. The Bible calls Moses a king. On this stone, Moses is called the Prince of the Desert. The Bible calls the Israelites God's people. The granite calls them the evil ones. And then, the granite corroborates the miracle of the parting of the sea. The symbol can be read by anyone. 3 waves and 2 knives. The parted sea.
The 3 water signs, one on top of the other, is typically used to apply to different types of bodies of water. It can apply to the Nile, can apply to a marsh, can apply to the sea. But what is not so common is when you have that word in combination with these 2 knives. The fact that you have these 2 knives associated with it would suggest that this is water that is cut, water that is divided. This might be an allusion to the waters that the Red Sea or the Reed Sea were divided in Exodus chapter 14.
Oh, I see it. To examine the text better, we got a pressing of the hieroglyphic. And as it turns out, the Egyptian text doesn't just mention the parting of the sea.
This is the best one. You see the 2 knives?
It also mentions a specific location next to where the sea parted. The place is called Pi Haroti, and today archaeologists know exactly where it was, enabling us to locate Yam Suf, the place where the Bible states the sea parted. The Israelites crossed to safety, and human history was changed forever.
It's an ancient lake that survived until the 1850s. When the Suez Canal was put in, this ancient lake finally died. Professor Manfred Bitak, after conducting thorough study of this area, proposed that this lake was known to the Egyptians as Patufi, the marshland, the marshy sea. And the word tuf, Egyptian word for reeds, is the same word as Suf in Hebrew. So that Yam Suf, he suggested, was a name derived from this body of water. Now, it's called the Al-Balach Lake.
Under the ever-watchful eye of the Egyptian authorities, we traveled to Lake El-Bala, the exact spot where one of the greatest biblical miracles is supposed to have taken place. The salt beds and reeds testify to the fact that at one time, the salty waters of the Mediterranean and the sweet waters of Lake El-Bala intermingled here.
Behind me is what's left of Lake Bala. You can see the salt marshes, you can see the reeds. This whole entire area was one big lake or sea. But because of the Suez Canal, today, you can literally walk or drive through the Sea of Reeds.
One of the problems most people have today is they pull out a map and they try to find out where were these places that the Bible's talking about. But you can't use a modern-day map. You have to use a map that's 3,000 years older. And we are working on this by taking satellite images where we can actually see the depressions from ancient lakes. And so we can actually begin to understand what the northeastern delta of Egypt was like 3,500 years ago.
Identifying the precise location of Yam Suf means that we can finally explain the miracle of the parting of the sea. This satellite photo clearly demonstrates that Lake El Bala is close to the edge of the Nile Delta, where silt accumulates and collapses from time to time. As Pharaoh chased the Israelites to the shores of Lake El Bala, the extreme seismic activity that caused the 10 plagues and the Santorini eruption would have now caused the delta to start sliding into the eastern Mediterranean. And as millions of tons of soil moved forward, the edge of the African plate, which had now been released from its burden, must have risen between 1 and 1.5 meters. In other words, the sea parted. Water would have cascaded from higher ground to lower ground and drained from pools and sinkholes, creating dry land for the Israelites to cross. At this point, further seismic activity or another collapse of the delta would have sent a major tsunami crashing against the coast.
We get some glimpse of these tidal waves in Turkey, where they carved out channeled scablands 30 miles inland. And in order to do that at the shore, they would have had to be more than half as high, these waves, as the Empire State Building. And that's exactly the description that we do have in the Bible.
If the tsunami went a mere 12 kilometers inland, it would have reached Lake El Bala and engulfed the Egyptian army. By this point, according to the Bible, the Israelites had advanced beyond the reach of the waves. As it turns out, some of the people that followed Moses across the parted sea and later to Mount Sinai did not follow him to the Promised Land. They boarded ships and sailed in an unknown exodus to Greece. Why hasn't anyone noticed? Because no one thought to look in Greece for evidence of an event that happened in Egypt. In fact, until recently, there was very little archaeological evidence of contact between the Minoan civilization of ancient Greece and Egypt at the time of Moses. All that changed with two great discoveries. The first was in 1972, when digging under the ash at Santorini, archaeologists made a startling discovery, linking this area of the world with the Exodus. They found unusual Minoan-style wall paintings. Incredibly, among them there is a map depicting an ancient journey from Egypt to Greece.
The whole scene may be considered as the earliest, the oldest map in the world.
The map is breathtaking. The colors as vibrant today as 3,500 years ago. It depicts an epic journey from Egypt to Santorini. The voyage is complete with a terrible storm at sea. Working even further back, we see that the ancient sailors sailed past Egyptian fauna and palm trees in the Nile Delta. The map then follows the river inland and it ends up in a magical city on a kind of river-bound island. This mysterious city is surrounded by high walls with multi-storied houses, elegant ladies peering from the rooftops, and a rich harbor. At the time, there was only one port in Egypt that fits the city in the map. The fabled Avaris. Until late in the 20th century, there was no archaeological proof of contact between Avaris and the Minoans of Santorini. Then, In 1992, perfectly preserved Minoan paintings were discovered at Avaris, proving that in biblical times, this city was populated not only by Israelites, but also by people from ancient Greece.
Most people do not realize that there was not only contact between the Minoan world and the Egyptians, it was very intense contact. Contact in trade, contact in ideas. We have the Egyptians referring to the Minoans as the only other civilization that they consider civilized. It was not a military presence in Egypt. It was actually a trade presence.
So we now know that there was intimate contact between Greece and Egypt at the time of the Exodus. As a result, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that some of the followers of Moses came from the area of ancient Greece. And it's quite possible that some of these people returned to Greece after the Exodus. The Bible says that Moses and his followers left Egypt with great quantities of swords and Egyptian gold. 3,500 years after the fact, is there any chance of finding Israelite swords and Egypt's golden treasures in Greece? This is Mycenae, 50 kilometers from the coast on the Greek mainland. In 1876, the famous archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, the excavator of Troy, made a world-shaking discovery at Mycenae. Here, he found 3,500-year-old tombs. The tombs are incredible, with long shafts leading to vaulted ceilings. They were built in the shadow of a mountain that has the shape of a pyramid. Surprisingly, they contained a treasure trove of swords and Egyptian gold. Schliemann believed that the gold belonged to Homer's Agamemnon, who led the war against Troy for the sake of the beautiful Helen. But scholars soon discovered that the people who were buried in the tombs lived about 300 years before Agamemnon. They lived around 1500 BCE. Is it possible that here lie some of the followers of Moses? The answer is on the tombstones that we now know were placed on top of the death chambers. The meaning of the images on the gravestones has never been deciphered until now.
If you ask scholars, what is it? They say, well, it looks like a hunt, but there's no animal. Or it looks like a battle, but there's no two people fighting. Let's look at it and let's see what in fact do the grave stelae of Mycenae actually testify to if we just look at it very simply, without any prejudice and without any preconceptions.
I almost want to whisper it's some kind of secret because nobody realizes that they have a 3,500-year-old movie, if you will, 3 frames of the parting of the sea. And they don't know it. They don't know it, but look at it. Just look at it. It's so clear. Frame number 1, you see waves on top and waves on the bottom. You actually literally see the parting of the sea. And this guy is on a chariot chasing Moses, who's holding a staff. That's frame number 1. And right over here, you have frame number 2 in the movie. The water is gathering into whirlpools. And look what's happened over here. Everybody thinks the man with the staff is the loser, but he's actually turned around. He's turned around. He's facing his enemy. He's occupying higher ground, and this guy is occupying lower ground. And look, there's walls of water coming. And in the 3rd frame, which is in another museum, even more hidden, You see, this guy's been overturned, the water is engulfing them, the horses are upended, and the story is complete.
But what do the experts say?
In this very example, the options can be mainly two. Either he is a warrior in a battle scene, and he's the enemy, he's chasing the enemy, and the enemy is trying to escape holding his sword. And the second option may be the chariot race scene.
So this guy is, this is kind of an ancient Olympics, this guy is unofficial, and this guy is racing around.
He is bearing a sword as well, and he's holding a sword.
This doesn't look like much of a sword, it looks more like a staff to me.
Yes, in this case, it's an abstract depiction. It's not a naturalistic depiction. So we cannot say much.
To understand what's going on here,
All you have to do is actually take this 3D image, which has been flattened out, and just pull it out. Just pull it out. And what you get is the biblical story.
When the three stelae are put together, what we see, exactly as depicted in the book of Exodus, is an Egyptian charioteer chasing Moses across the parted sea. Then, Moses turns and faces his pursuer. Walls of water rise and come down on the Egyptians. Finally, rider, chariot, and horses are drowned.